9 out of 22 CANDU reactors in Canada will close by 2025. That's almost half the fleet. 2 have already closed at Pickering A in 2005 permanently because of the prohibitive cost of life extension. Then they move forward. They have rebuilt some, like at Point Lepreau, which went massively over budget. Same with 2 at Bruce A, which also went $2 billion over budget. And those cost overruns informed the decision to close Gentilly, but also the long-term decision to close the remaining 6 Pickering reactors and not rebuild them. We're now in a debate on like how long they can operate those plants, but the main takeaway is almost half of the fleet is closing. And that's a good news story that we need to tell ourselves more. Like the industry is in decline.
You are listening to TMI for the week of April 2nd, 2018.
This week our guest, Shawn-Patrick Stensil, is an award-winning environmental activist. Shawn-Patrick Stensil is a senior energy analyst with Greenpeace Canada. He was previously the Director of Atmosphere and Energy for Sierra Club of Canada. He is a frequent media commentator on nuclear and green energy issues and testifies regularly on nuclear policy and regulatory issues to parliamentary committees and government agencies such as the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the CNSC. You can sign up for the Greenpeace Toronto anti-nuke group Don't Nuke TO. If you want to join the fight and close reactors in the GTA, please join. If you want to speak out against Pickering, sign up for that. See our podcast webpage for links to Don't Nuke TO and for ways to get involved and speak out against Pickering. How did you get interested in energy?
Well, originally I got hired, to be blunt, to work for the Campaign for Nuclear Phase Out around 2002. So it was a coalition group in Ottawa. And before that I was less interested in energy, but I'd always done environmental activism through my university years. And I'd been working in Quebec City in 2002 with all the anti-globalization movement work there. And when the job with the Campaign for Nuclear Phase-Out came up, I saw some overlap, I guess, at the level of democratic issues and environmental issues. A lot of things that go on with anti-globalization is kind of the exclusion of people from decision-making, and there's a lot of that in the nuclear field.
So it's a symbol of globalization and corporatization.
Corporate control, lack of citizen control, and frankly, the world that we want. You know, when you, in French, they call them les ultra-mondialistes, so ultra-globalizationalists or ultra-globalists. They'll talk a lot more about what the world would look like, not just opposing. And, you know, in that world, we're running more of our economy. And I see a lot of that in the energy field. It becomes a lot more tangible, and we're starting to see some of this in Germany, where instead of 3 major corporations running their energy system, a larger and larger percentage of energy generation in Germany is being done through citizen power, cooperative power, and municipal power. And to me, that's the world that I want to move towards. It has democratic benefits because people are controlling, their means of production, you use words like that, but also deriving local benefits and also living with, when there are downsides, it's also those communities that are living with them and making the decisions on those benefits and those negatives. Whereas at this upper scale, as we know in Ontario, we've never had a public discussion of those benefits and negatives of having the province dependent on just a few big suppliers that end up having too much control over government. So it may seem a bit academic, but that was one of my original attractions to it.
And on a simple level, different regions are going to have different requirements and answers for their energy needs.
Completely. And again, what gives me hope is this would have seemed ludicrous 10 years ago, but the 100% renewable movement is growing worldwide. More and more cities are saying, we're going to go 100% renewable. The original motivation, again, is climate change, typically, but it's also the local benefits that they're controlling their power. They're getting economic benefit from the power. They have a more resilient electricity energy system. And here in Ontario, Oxford County in the southwest has committed to go 100% renewable. So they've done this outside of the broader debate that has always gone on mostly between NGOs and the government on like what is the next energy plan. And, you know, we produce models for the whole province. Here you have a small conservative county saying we're going to go 100% renewable. We need to do this to fight climate change. Other communities are doing it locally or internationally, and we're going to do it here. We're going to test drive this. And the fact that that is now not seen as crazy is, I think, a good reason to have hope. Is like ideas have shifted on what the possible is so much in the past 10 years. And my hope is, and maybe this is the place for future activism, is we need more communities in Ontario to do that bottom up. We were always getting resistance out of the three main political parties, but the more local power and initiatives we have, the more of a counterpoint we're going to have against the nuclear and fossil lobbies.
So you give very entertaining presentations. Where does that come from? Where did you learn how to do that? Is this something that happened on the job over time, or did your early activism experience lend you to that? Or were you an annoying kid who just wouldn't shut up? And
depends who you ask on that question, I guess. I have to say, when I was a kid, I still am fairly shy, but I was horrified of public presentations. And I think I learned to deal with it. I was in a rock band. I played music in my teens and 20s, and that gave me
a big thing. What did you play?
Guitar. And then moved on to bass because I got too lazy. But that gives you a confidence boost. And then part of it was just going out and doing, learn by doing how to present.
You have to knock on doors and talk to strangers and present before panels and be webcast. And this is a difficult thing. It's something that most people that would be a deal breaker for.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the pieces for activism where we all need to help each other, but also for new activists. I think what the government and an industry that we're opposing is they want to shut us down. They want to say, you're not an expert. You don't have the right to speak out on this issue. You don't have an interest in this. And you hear this at CNSC hearings, like how we get dismissed. And I think one of the first things in activism is helping people, like the new activists that come through, helping people have the license so that they feel that they also have a right to speak out. Like these issues affect them, and they don't need that expertise to have an opinion and have an informed opinion on things. And I think that is it's a hard thing. And, take me as an example. I have a degree in historical geography, and I speak out all the time at Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission meetings. And, early on they used to dismiss me a lot more now, but I taught myself. And anyone can do that. And we need to not buy into to what the industry wants, is that people don't have that type of expertise. And I think part of activism is speaking out and having, speaking truth to power and helping people have the courage. Seeing other people that have walked that way is how we build movements over time.
Maybe this is a stupid thing to ask. I keep thinking there's connections between stand-up comedy and people who make these presentations. Now that sounds like I'm putting down the seriousness of the presentations themselves. But if you were speaking before any group of people, you'd have to make what you're saying interesting. And one of the things we do is have the odd thing that's kind of a chuckle. It's part of how you engage your audience. But having the guts to get up there, preparing your material beforehand, delivering it, sometimes as it's written or off-point forms that you make. You have to hold it together, not be intimidated by what's going on in the room. You can't be intimidated by the people you're speaking to. You have to. I think a lot of similarities exist between stand-up comedy and just in the guts alone.
Well, there's probably the sense of the absurd, if you have like a dark sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in front of the CNSC, a lot of the things that we're talking about are like, I don't know, everything's robust and unlikely and could, smash out Toronto. It's a bit dark. But I think on the presentation side, if the connection with stand-up is being able to read your audience, to me is the main thing. And what's also dark about that is it's trying to figure out how to empathize with the commission. How do you get behind what's in their head? What is motivating them to try and get them to take you seriously when they think you're just the guy from Greenpeace or some, emotional anti-nuke? That's, I think, also a bit absurd sometimes. It's difficult. And we have a new commission coming in, so I think there'll be a new space of trying to figure out what makes these people tick. But for me, I always I think I'm a campaigner to begin with. And I think a lot of campaigning, if you're trying to change the world, starts with empathy, right? Trying to understand and feel for what your opponent is doing, understanding why they're doing that. Even if you really disagree with it and are completely opposed to it, I think to really understand what motivates people so that you can try to persuade them. So you can get them to try and see another point of view, because a lot of them will be fairly close-minded. They're not going to be empathetic. I think that's a lot of work.
That's very interesting. So the message there is that if you came in from an adversarial position, you define the nature of anything moving forward. It's sticking to that adversarial arrangement. Plus, I do get the idea that the CNSC will label somebody as just being clearly anti-nuclear and then dismiss
writing
what they're saying. But I think that's a lesson that even in life is true. If your goal isn't to read off an indictment of what they're doing, but actually affect some kind of change, then that's completely inappropriate method. And unfortunately, I think that's the nature of the presentations I've given.
Well, it depends what you're trying to do,
right?
Like I think it's fair to go in and shock and, if that's what you're trying to do in that context. Like you may not be playing to the CNSC. These things are webcast. You may be doing a presentation to make the point of how absurd it is, of how far off this commission is from everyday Canadians in the way they see risk in the world. In that sense, if you're playing to that audience, I think that's fair. I think a lot of people, though, struggle with and can be a little paralyzed by in presenting to the CNSC, being clear about what their audience is. Like I always view, I'm a cynic, this is not a commission that's going to shut a reactor down. Like their mandate, what motivates them is to hold this industry up in some way, but with a pretense that they're taking care of things that they've been mandated with in legislation. That's fair. So if that's the way they're thinking and you're trying to move them on a little point, going at that might have more space, for them to maybe see eye to eye. But when you go in and, you're basically saying you need to shut these plants down, like they're going to shut down. That's not their worldview. So if you're fine with that going in and realizing I'm doing this to make a point, I'm doing this to expose not to the commission, but to the media and other people how absurd this process is that holds up this industry that can't afford itself. That's a good thing to do as well. It's just being really clear on what's the absurd audience you're playing to. And none of it's right, but it's just the space that we're given.
How does Canadians' approach to these regulatory hearings differ from other countries is something I've been wondering.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been to Korea. I've attended their hearings, and it was this is in South Korea. This is about 3 years ago. I was asked to go over because they have Canadian reactors there, CANDUs at Wolsung, and there is massive resistance against the life extension of those reactors in that country. They're very close to Japan, and Fukushima was a big wake-up in South Korea, and the anti-nuclear movement is huge. And so I was invited, and I got to attend a hearing of the South Korean nuclear regulator while it was deciding on the fate of Wolsung and its life extension. And what's interesting, well, as an aside, I could understand what was going on a little bit because they use Canadian standards. So everything would be in Korean, and then they would drop Guide R7. I'm like, oh, I know they're talking about X. So it was a really long hearing, so I depended on these moments. But what's a bit different is they have less public intervention, one, but also the commissioners are appointed in a very different way. They're all explicitly political. So there was actually 2 people on that commission that were appointed, I think, by the Greens in government that were seen as also anti-nuke in their positioning, and they're on the commission.
Wow.
And unlike in the Canadian case, where the commission presents and then they go back into conclave, make a decision, and then issue a record of decision a month later, they voted on it in front of everybody in the room.
Wow.
So in that sense, it's very, very, very different than what we have here. I think the Canadian process actually had some attributes that we're losing. The fact that we were having these public relicensing when I started doing anti-nuclear work was once every 2 years. And now they're asking for 10-year licenses. So there was a lot more transparency than where we're going. So we're in fact losing that.
And there's the combined licenses where they're killing 2 birds with 1 stone, really.
Yeah, it's amazing. We used to have every 2 years you would have license, on every Pickering would have 2 licenses, one for Pickering A, one for Pickering B. Now it's a consolidated license. Now they're doing it with the waste sites as well. And we're extending it out to 10 years.
Now, they would claim that's because so they can have some predictability of their investments moving forward. I don't know why they're protecting the industry that way, but is it so that they could reduce the number of hearings they have? And if that's the case, are these hearings actually a thorn in their side?
I think since Fukushima, they have been. Fukushima happened in 2011. You saw the 2012 Darlington life extension hearings. Hundreds of people showed up, complained that we weren't looking at major accidents. And it was interesting, again, watching how the commission reacted is, in the past, there would be me and, Teresa McClenahan from SELA and Waterkeeper, these usual expert NGO experts. But in this case, you had hundreds of other people making very basic arguments, like, why have you never looked at the impacts of a major accident? And the staff would have, their glib response. But after 4 days, it started to sink in even to the commissioners that those were not good responses. And out of that, what did we get? It was not good enough at all, but it was the severe accident study that the commission did a few years ago that didn't look at a Fukushima accident, but did look at a larger-ish accident. And that was the first time they'd done that publicly. And that led to the issue of, in that study, they found an increase in childhood thyroid cancer in the event of a less than Fukushima accident. And that informed their decision to do KI distribution. Look what happens when the public actually gets to meaningfully intervene, and you put evidence on the table. And to your point, I think there's a bunch of other examples like this since Fukushima. That's why they're going to these 10-year licenses. I think this is Binder's legacy leaving is, this process is attracting attention. It's putting pressure on the industry, and now they're shifting to less transparency and less public participation. That's my read. It's an allegation. I can't prove it. But we were getting slightly better decisions in a window there after Fukushima, and now everything that was forcing those decisions is being taken out of the process. It's too bad.
It sounds like a slight difference in Britain is that it sounds a little bit more judicial, where there's actually a ruling and there's presentation in a more evidence court-like structure. I keep wondering, what what about Japan? Especially after one of the big things they indicted was their process of regulation. I would think that they would become the world-class example of public hearings over there. Have they changed public interaction?
I don't know, but they've changed the regulator. They've made the regulator more independent. I don't know how their public participation process works, actually. But I think to your point on a more judicial process in the UK or even in the United States, which maybe is a little too far over, the Canadian process has always been limited by the lack of evidence, the lack of ability to cross-examine OPG or even CNSC staff. They make these statements, and it's usually half of my work is like, well, where's the proof of that? What is that statement based on? And often they don't know, like when you really pick at it. And in other processes, like the Ontario Energy Board, for example, you can hire lawyers and cross-examine, but they also leave it open that anyone from the public, a lot of people don't know this, can just go up while OPG is doing its rate application and ask them some questions. It's fair game. When that's been raised in front of the current CNSC president, Binder, he's like, I don't want this to be too judicial. But why? Well, maybe because we might catch you on some facts, and get to better decisions.
So that sounds crazy, but there's actually a U.S. example that resulted in San Onofre closing down, and they railroaded past having public hearings. They were replacing a substantial part. They had redesigned it. This usually calls for public hearings, and people have speculated that if those public hearings had occurred, people, expert witnesses, would have pointed out and asked tough questions about, can you compress more tubes into the same space or change the fundamental design of how the tubes are arranged? So it cost them a nuclear power plant not having public hearings. So there is some actual value in them, not least of which is protecting the public. But
I think often the industry gets scared of them, for good reason. Like as that's a good point exactly, right? And so it's kind of a give and take. Like after Fukushima, for example, OPG, they wouldn't delay the hearings. I don't know if you remember this. We asked, Fukushima happened on March 11th. And then the hearings on whether to build new reactors at Darlington started on March 20th or something ridiculous. And the NGO community was like, you should probably pause this. We should learn from it and figure out how to move forward. And they just refused, because what they were worried about was lots of people intervening, like increased interest. What eventually happened, though? The project got dropped. For all these other reasons, that was just clear it wasn't like socially acceptable. So,
what would happen if they held one of these public hearings in like Kensington Market as opposed to the middle of nowhere?
The site of the hearing, to the CNSC's credit, they have over the past 15 years started to hold the hearings in the host communities, quote unquote. What's notable about an upcoming hearing on the request to continue operating the Pickering nuclear station is they're not holding it in Pickering. They're holding it in Curtis, which is by Darlington, almost 30 kilometers away. And they're saying they're holding it there because they couldn't find any place in Pickering. But instead of moving into Scarborough, where there are lots of sites, it is a major city, there are schools, there are hotels, you could find a site. They decided to go in the opposite direction, which I think that was frankly just a political decision. Instead of going closer to where there would be more people that are concerned, because this site is in a city, there are 1 million people within 20 kilometers, they decided to go in the opposite direction. So to your point, you'll get more public participation.
It wouldn't take much in Ontario because people are literally obsessed with the price of electricity, at least in the political pundits are, as a tool against wind. It's interesting. In order to blame wind for our electricity prices, you have to believe the entire can-do process was perfect up until Ernie Eves, and forget about the largest bankruptcy in the history of money on our planet. The bankruptcy of Ontario Hydro. So, I mean, how do politics fit into all of this when it appears, I've often said, the three main parties are equally pro-nuclear? Maybe that you could give the NDP a little bit of a break, but I've actually worked for members of the NDP who are rabidly pro-nuclear. These three parties essentially have largely the same policies. These decisions, though they're voted on or recommended on by the CNSC, ultimately become political decisions. You know, other than the Green Party, what hope do we have in the politics affecting these decisions?
Well, the politics should be informed by evidence and a public process. And so I think in parallel, we focus a lot on the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, probably because they've, to their credit, just until now, were one of the few places where there were public hearings. And I think you'd hear people in the CNSC say we've become this forum of dealing with all the other concerns about nuclear power that are actually the province's responsibility. And here, I think, for placing blame on all the parties, we have seen a significant decline in what is the equivalent provincial process for reviewing these nuclear projects. So take safety out of it. If you're dealing with cost and you're dealing with alternatives, what process is there provincially to make those decisions, to pull out the evidence that then would inform the NDP, the Liberals, and the Tories? And I think what they're all complicit in is there is no process. So all of the parties are making statements on, well, this is the best option. The life extensions on Darlington, on Bruce, and even like the short continued operation of Pickering have not been publicly reviewed. There have been decisions made internally, but the Ontario Energy Board is very explicit, if you read its ruling, where they say we do not have the mandate, because the province told us, to look at the cost effectiveness or desirability of these projects. So there is no public space to actually have that debate. So it may sound weird, but sometimes I'm sympathetic with the CNSC that they have people showing up complaining about people need to look at alternatives, et cetera, et cetera. It's not really their mandate. That is really the province's mandate, and it should be done at the Ontario Energy Board, and it has not been done. And that's one of, I think, the most underreported and analyzed public interest issues in the province. Is that process doesn't exist. Greenpeace and SELA, Lake Ontario Waterkeeper a few years ago, or 2 years ago, put in a complaint through the Environmental Commissioner's Office, basically asking for such a process, documenting, how it's likely that these projects are not economically desirable. And the province just said no.
I never thought about it that way. So it's obvious that the CNSC has a jurisdiction, and that's evidenced by the fact, like as you point out, that if you bring up certain questions or issues, it's outside of the domain. So what they've done is they've divided it in half: morality, geopolitics, long-term environment, questions of like I already mentioned morality, economics, etc. They put it into a category, and it's entirely outside of the public domain. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and so then they say, well, there's no public controversy on nukes, and everything's fine, but there's no evidence. To me, it's just like there's no evidence to show that, and it's also where there may be little pieces of evidence, it hasn't been tested. The examples we just used from the CNSC, where evidence finally started impacting the process, it's when the public came in and said, you're making all these claims about in the event of a Fukushima accident, but you've never modeled one. You have no evidence. And it's that type of common sense check that you don't need experts for. You can hire some of them, that we don't have on that. Just what is our energy policy, especially on these big projects. Like these big projects, and windmills get a lot of bad publicity, but the Bruce contract is like the biggest contract in Ontario history. It's never been vetted that we need to rebuild all 10 of these reactors. There should be a similar, to be honest about a democratic process, we should have such a process, and we don't.
Should have referendums, and we should have royal commissions, but that's not going to happen.
There's different ways to do it, but evidence-based decision-making is a big style right now. You hear this in the media all the time. And I think on this issue in particular, usually there's no evidence on the table.
Wow. I never looked at it that way. What, you do a lot of interviews. What is it journalists and interviewers aren't asking you?
There's not many of them left. We're seeing an erosion of media. So just the number, the Toronto Star doesn't have an energy reporter anymore. No one reports on energy. And it's a complex issue. To do a story in a day, you have to read a lot of documents, be balanced.
Energy has been at the center of every political event for 10 years.
Yeah.
Every single, the proroguing of the Parliament, scandals, I mean, in every way, energy taxes, carbon taxing, the windmills, I mean, the price of electricity, I mean, every single little tension that's occurred has been centered on, and how can you have a newspaper without an energy writer?
Yeah. Well, it's Canada's largest daily paper. So John Spears was covering it, and he was covering it from a business perspective, not from a nuclear safety or an environmental perspective. So that's even missing some pieces. But I think the other thing I noticed when I first started doing this work around 2002, I had some background in it, and I remember speaking to a reporter when there was a first proposal to build new reactors in Ontario. And I was like, well, that's crazy. The last reactor was $10 billion over budget at Darlington. This reporter would not believe me. She was young. She was 20. Like, she was maybe 10 when that happened. And she didn't have that background and needed cynicism to just know, like, I should be more skeptical of these guys than these guys. I had to go through and dig out some of the original articles showing it $10 billion over budget. And then she wrote a great story. But there's a lot of that as well. Like the scandals that went on in the 80s and 90s, if you got a journalist coming through now, brand new, they wouldn't have been exposed to any of that. The best journalists right now writing on nukes tend to be some of these older people that have seen it, and they know to be skeptical about when a press release comes out from Bruce Power. They're like, we need to check this.
Okay, not to attack young people, but I've seen it myself. Otherwise brilliant reporter makes claims like, CANDU spent fuel and or reactors can't be used for weapons in any possible way. It's just physically impossible. And it's like, it's because she wrote an essay during her education at some point, and she got an A on it, but it wasn't peer reviewed. And she thinks she's an expert on it because she did a project on it or a story on it at some point,
or she doesn't have time. Like I'm again going back to trying to be sympathetic. If you have to file 2 stories a day, how do you look through to find out how proliferation can actually happen in a CANDU, right? It takes a bit of time. So just understanding that it's a dynamic that we're dealing with right now. That's why things like this show are a great thing, because we need people to make their own media and share it with their friends on this other background information and using other outlets. That's what needs to happen for people to be well informed. So thank you.
Yeah, it might be the only anti-nuclear podcast in Canada.
That's a great start.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole world out there. I forgot Canada isn't the entire world. So questions that you don't get asked, because when you are interviewed, it's in very compressed bites. And you don't get to go much, you're kind of capped in a lane with sound bites, whether it's a CBC interview or even for a printed publication. And we are more and more compressed into smaller and smaller sound bites. And this is a complex issue and requires full sentences and paragraphs, really. What do you think about young people? The gun protests in the United States, young people are always sometimes on the right side of history, as some people have said. It's young people we look to be activists often. Some wonders if something happens to you once you get to 25 and you stop caring about important things. But But how are young people looking to Greenpeace? Are people still trying to get involved and donate their time? And
Yeah, I was at a meeting on Saturday of like 10 young volunteers wanting to speak out against Pickering. And some of them, again, going back to the CNSC hearings, another useful thing with CNSC hearings, again, for someone that's never seen how this system gets supported, I have found a lot of young people, when they just attend the hearings or, screw up the courage to make a presentation, they usually come out of it an anti-nuclear activist. Because they go into it and they're like, holy crap, this is how they make decisions on this? Just watching a CNSC hearing and the jargon and BS that will be punted around, a lot of young people, it's in Greenpeace parlance, we talk about bearing witness. When you see something that is an injustice, it changes you. And I've seen a lot of young folks come through, especially since Fukushima, seeing these CNSC processes that a lot of the older folks in the anti-nuclear movement are really cynical about. But it's these hearings that actually galvanize. They're like, yeah, I'm against this. So there's a positive element there, and I think a need why we need to keep doing. It may feel like we're repeating things, but there are these other added values for the movement over time about having people speak out in these fora. But to your point around young people coming up, yeah, and they're coming at it for other reasons than in the past. Like, we're of a certain vintage. We lived through the Cold War. I did a presentation in Hamilton on Friday, and everyone was in their 20s. And, I had to do some background on what the Cold War was. Greenpeace came out of above air bomb testing. That's not really an issue for this generation. Climate change is, and there's also a lot of support for moving towards renewables. The concept of we can go to 100% renewables is a positive draw for a lot of young activists that aren't coming at it from the same. They're being motivated by climate change, but they also see 100% renewables about that's the world that I want.
That's really interesting. So the movements in the 70s and 80s, though solar was around, it was still a bit of a dream, but now it's going up as you and I speak, left, right, and center. So it's not a pie-in-the-sky dream. This is a viable alternative.
Take the train to Windsor. You go 10 years ago, it wasn't like this, but you pass all these solar farms on farms and windmills. So this is something it's becoming normalized. And to me, that's actually what gives me a lot of hope is, 10 years ago, when you would bump into a student that was an engineer, they'd be going into nuclear engineering because it's what you do in Ontario. And now there's a lot of them, they want to solve the problems, because that's what engineers love doing, solving technical problems of how you get renewables on the grid, how you build a more decentralized electricity system where you can charge your car at night and power it by solar during the day. That's a changing dynamic. And a lot of these people, they may not be coming at the anti-nuclear piece directly, but they see that as an obstacle to the world they want to go to.
How did Quebec get rid of its 2 nuclear power plants? And was that tied to the province's desire to expand their hydro?
Well, that's complicated. The first one, there's Gentilly, the site close to Trois-Rivières, and there was Gentilly 1 in the 1970s. That was an experimental reactor. It only operated for about 200 days, and then they had to shut it down. And it wasn't even owned by Hydro-Quebec. It was owned by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. So, again, one of these many can-do designs that this one actually got off the drawing board, but couldn't operate. It was too unstable. So that one died. And then they managed to build what they call Gentilly 2, Gentilly 2, that went around online, I think, around 1981. And there was a lot of push in the 80s to build additional plants, but they thankfully got kiboshed. And there has always been more of an emphasis on large hydro there, which also has its own problems. But there was a big push, especially from the Parti Québécois, what used to be quite pro-nuclear in the 1980s. Ironically, they were under Pauline Marois, was the party that shut down Gentilly. The debate that went on around Gentilly started around 2002. I was at that meeting where we said, hey, they want to rebuild this plant. And it took, it's a marathon, not a sprint. it wasn't until 2012 that the plant actually shut down. And in between, they had committed to rebuild it around 2007. So it wasn't a direct linear line on how we got there, but a lot of what happened around mobilizing people to speak out, but also exposing, again, back to evidence-based, what are the real costs? Is there really a need for this plant? What are you going to do with the radioactive waste? We used it was like an environmental assessment process to continually expose these misleading statements that were being put out there until we eventually won, but also built a pretty large coalition of groups that advocated its closure.
I'm guessing that part of the decision was about the cost of refurbing. And how does that feather into the experience at Point Lepreau? Was that decision informed by cost overruns at Point Lepreau, or was that before or after?
It was after the cost overrun started. So this is with CANDU. So the good news story is the line that I will always continue to use is 9 out of 22 CANDU reactors in Canada will close by 2025. That's almost half the fleet. 2 have already closed at Pickering A in 2005 permanently because of the prohibitive cost of life extension. Then they move forward. They have rebuilt some, like at Point Lepreau, which went massively over budget. Same with 2 at Bruce A, which also went $2 billion over budget. And those cost overruns informed the decision to close Gentilly, but also the long-term decision to close the remaining 6 Pickering reactors and not rebuild them. We're now in a debate on how long they can operate those plants, but the main takeaway is almost half of the fleet is closing. And that's a good news story that we need to tell ourselves more. The industry is in decline.
I'm working on my math here. Okay, so 2 have closed at Pickering already. That leaves 6. Where are the other 3 that you're saying 9 of 20?
Gentilly is closed.
Okay.
And then 6 more. The remaining 6 at Pickering will close. Mm-hmm. So there's 8 at Pickering, and then Gentilly. Mm-hmm. So that's 9.
What's Douglas Point? And it sounds like Douglas Point and Gentilly 1 and 2. This is an example of, them cleaning up after themselves. These things are going to sit for decades and nothing's going to be done, really. They're just going to sit there.
Yeah, those are, I guess they call them Generation 1 reactors. So now we have what are effectively Generation 2. So Generation 1 were the late 50s and 60s designs. And then the current CANDU fleet, Pickering's quite early, it was designed in the 60s. They say is Generation 2. Sometimes they'll fib and try to say it's Generation 3, but they change definitions around to make themselves look good. But those original half prototype reactors that have been shut down, like Gentilly 1 is still there and it hasn't been decommissioned after 30 years. And a big push in the campaign to close Gentilly, the locals were saying, why don't we clean this plant up to help ease the transition with the other Gentilly workers? That hasn't really been taken up, but yeah, these are garbage sitting there in the long term.
It's been suggested that this idea that we have to wait 40 years before we lift a finger at nuclear power plants to decommission them is just a fallacy and a stalling technique. They could roll in there anytime and remove fuel rods and I mean, this is proven by their decommissioning and refurbishment of Darlington. That reactor was running. They're right in there doing all the same stuff you'd do if you were decommissioning. So it's another lie.
Yeah, and when you listen to their arguments on what you're saying is their arguments on delayed decommissioning, it is effectively saying, well, if we did early decommissioning or accelerated decommissioning, we'd be exposing people unnecessarily to radiation, the workers. Well, with refurbishment, they don't seem to care. They're in a rush, happy to send people in there. And so it doesn't add up. And what's more, they're learning how to use robotics more and more for the actual removal. OPG is doing this on the latest refurbs. They're doing some things better than they did in the Point Lepreau days. So that reduces dose. But when I talk to other people in the industry, one thing they've learned about decommissioning at other plants, light water plants, is that when you close a plant down, if you wait 40 years, there's only so much that you can keep on paper. Like they have to basically put into a library so that a future generation can come back and be like, all right, where are the dirty spots of this plant that we need to be careful of? A lot of that information is actually institutional knowledge. It's in the workers' brains, and they've found at other sites it's better to clean it up while existing workers are there because they're familiar with the site and where it's messy. And it just saves you a lot of trouble in the long term. Again, this is a delay tactic so that they can avoid talking about what the full cost of these plants are. Delay over and over again.
This was actually touched on very briefly in this recent meeting where they were talking about a framework for site preparation. If they were doing site preparation for a new build near a nuclear facility, they even covered in their discussion on it the chances of coming across buried things. Like, what if they've been buried?
I have heard stories, how to say this without naming it, up at Chalk River Laboratories. Believe it or not, it was only in 2000, under the Nuclear Safety Control Act, that reactor operators or licensees had to start putting aside money to decommission the plants. So that's less than 20 years ago. As well as developing a plan that would be aligned with the amount of money they're putting aside on how to decommission. And with Chalk River, up north of Ottawa, it's a really old and messy site. They had a really hard time developing their plan because they had waste there dating back from the 50s. And I had some federal bureaucrats relay to me when they were doing their costing. They had these documents from the 1950s. At this site X, there were like 20 barrels buried in 1953, and then they went digging, and there was 100 barrels, and they didn't know what's in it. And so, yeah, to your point, yes, they've gotten a lot better at their paperwork, but people forget things, right? And standards used to be really, really bad as well. So for that type of documentation, for new reactors, they actually have a rule to have something called a design authority, which is, it's not just the waste, it's when they designed some of these plants, they've over time lost track of the paper of how that design worked. Because Pickering would have been designed on punch card computers in like 1965. So if you're going back to look for the original specs for X widget, you're depending that piece of paper, because it was on paper, got kept over the past 40 years. And so for new reactors, they have this license requirement that the full design has to be, archived and very clear, because at other sites, they've just lost track of that. Scary on an industry with these kind of timelines. I've raised it often regarding radioactive waste, on that they need to have basically an archiving program. It shouldn't just be left to be an OPG's, computer-based some way. They should have local libraries that keep all of these documents that people can go through. It's a bit wonky, but again, if you want people to go and verify what some of these statements are in 100 years, how are you going to get the information?
So this is a totally weird example. So in my family, there used to be a caboose, and it's a wooden caboose, the end caboose, built around the turn of the century. So it's interesting that if you look at the actual blueprints for the caboose, it has been stamped every 5 or 10 years with another revision. And because, they would change the brakes, they would change out certain parts, and each time they would add something or remove it, it has to be stamped onto the plans. And you wind up with one plan, but with millions of addendum. Imagine how that would apply to a 40 or 50-year-old nuclear reactor.
Yep.
That's insane.
Yep. Well, it even gets to things in the 2013 Pickering relicensing on emergency preparedness. One of the requirements in CNSC licensing is something called minimum shift complement. So it's the number of staff they have to have on site in the event of an accident. So, you can't just have one person there, because they'll be trying to cool the reactor while, calling people to come in. So there's an actual requirement saying this many people have to be on site. And after Fukushima, the question started to become, well, there's there's 6 reactors at this site. And what was the basis for this minimum shift complement? It's one of the things that happened at Fukushima is they had 3 reactors melting down. There wasn't enough staff to cope with all that, in addition to a tsunami, right? And so if you want to verify, is this a sufficient standard, you have to look at what was the original requirement and thinking behind it. And OPG went and did a large literature review, and they couldn't figure out what it was from. They used a word. What was the word? They just said it's something that's been lost in time, and then made all these statements about it's all sufficient. But at all previous hearings, they'd always said everything we meet requirements, it's all sufficient, it's all very rigorous. But they didn't know the justification behind this one little rule. And it was a justification probably based on a fairly small scale accident, at one reactor. That was, somebody made up the numbers in 1968. They lost all the paperwork. But the standard has just like a zombie come through time till now, and no one had ever gone back and looked to see what it was from and whether it was sufficient.
So you do some things that the public could never do, like you actually can get freedom of information requests for information and stuff like that only really an institution could afford to do, spend the time on processing, fighting back and forth. That's one of the things that you do. If I was them, I would have an operator operate all of the reactors, and then people like you couldn't get freedom of information, because is it not true that you can only get this information because it's government run?
Yeah, your question is totally on point. OPG is a crown corporation, so I can FOI OPG. I can FOI the CNSC because it's federal ATIP, access to information. I can't FOI Bruce Power.
Nice track.
Yeah. But they still do other games where the way licensing works in Canada is the CNSC sets general safety goals, and then there's a lot of paperwork between the CNSC correspondents and the operators on how they'll meet that goal. And what happens is that correspondence is where all the decisions get made. And so trying to get a hold of that correspondence is very, very difficult. And what OPG says, if I send an ATI to the CNSC saying, give me all of the correspondence to get to X decision, CNSC will come back and say, OPG says you have to send a specific request to them. And then OPG will charge us, Greenpeace, a lot of money so that they can search and find those documents. They put up these barriers. Fortunately, I can do this because of my job, but it's something that should be a lot more simpler so that anyone can do it. In the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has this ACES, I think is the system, where almost all their documentation is put online. Where in the Canadian system, it's just a bit of a black box. We get the commission member documents that summarize everything, but it's the correspondence behind it that's actually important and should be available, or accessible at least, and it's not.
This is why we need Greenpeace and Northwatch and CELA.
And I have to say that the big piece, it's not only getting the information, it's then reading it, which can take quite a while.
And they're not going to send you exactly what you want, or they'll make your request have to be so specific that you have to know what you want before you've been able to figure out what you need.
Yeah, there's a bit of an art to it. If they want to slow you up, they will either ask you for money. OPG does this a lot. Or the other strategy that you can use is just give you everything. And you have to find the time to read it all. And this industry creates a lot of paper. And with overtime, I've learned to know when they produce a document and when. And you can do, it's like deep trawling. It's deep sea trawling versus spear fishing. If you can name the document, you can get it pretty quick, but it takes a while to figure out that the document exists.
SMRs. It sounds like the solution to basically nothing. If all of this infrastructure that they spent trillions of dollars building, in adjusted dollars for today, doesn't seem to be profitable, one argues it's because it lacks an economy of scale. how will you get economy of scale out of a small modular reactor?
Yeah. I'll take a step back and contextualize SMRs. What happens about once a decade with this industry is they need a new promise. Like, they haven't built a lot of reactors since the 70s. And about once a decade, they'll say there's a new design. And it's usually a recycled design that will be cheaper, more safer, et cetera, solve social problems. It's a long list of things. And so there's that piece. And then they often rotate between the size of the reactor. So at certain points in the early 1990s, the Canadian industry was promoting something called the CANDU 300. So it was a 300 megawatt reactor. And they said, this is because people don't want huge reactors like Darlington. Like, Darlington had just gone online when they didn't need the power. So they flooded the electricity market and canceled conservation programs. So then they said, what we can do is we've got this great small design. Can be built incrementally. It didn't sell. 10 years later, they came back and said, well, what's really needed is a large design. So they had the CANDU 900. Also didn't sell. Then in the 2000s, again, the same piece. It was the advanced CANDU reactor. They started out with, at the time, did they start large or start small? Say they started small. I think it was the ACR 600. Again, it didn't sell. Then they said, we're changing the design to the ACR 1000. So all this to say, there's a back and forth, and SMRs fit into this. We're now in the next decade, and the way electricity planning is going is things are getting really decentralized. Electricity demand is not growing like they used to predict in the past. That's what you need to build a 1,000 megawatt plant. And so they're again saying we can build these little plants that can meet demand incrementally, or because of climate change, displace diesel in the north. So this is the current packaged promise. And some of those designs go up to 300 megawatts, what they're calling SMRs. Some are really small, some go up to 300. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast. But that context, why I bring that up, is like, this is the new promise on how the solution to a problem that they're trying to find for themselves. And so the push on SMRs right now, they've done a few things. One, they say it's all about the north. We will get communities off diesel in the north. And then again, it's the smaller, cheaper, safer, et cetera, et cetera. The smaller, cheaper, safer probably won't happen. They're all mostly experimental designs. And they haven't, I haven't really seen them talk to any northern communities to ask if that's what they actually want.
Wow.
And if you go to places like Alaska, there's a lot of move right now with renewables and storage. They're displacing diesel with localized microgrids. And they've, the federal government commissioned this big study on, are SMRs cheaper than diesel? They didn't commission an equivalent study on microgrids. And that's where I think things will come out with time. We need to push them on just that point there.
I forget what to do with the waste, or how to isolate it from people. Or the trick with some of these SMRs, the advocates, at least a few years ago, was you could locate them closer to big cities and save having to pull new wire. And then I imagine a world where on Main Street it's dump trucks or garbage trucks with the nuclear waste emblem on the side of nuclear waste would become ubiquitous. And here, these reactor designs lack the conventional containment. And so, yeah, the solution to nothing is what I expect from... But the people who are advocating for it, at least on social media, make it sound like it's a great new thing and about to take hold. I think every week there's another announcement.
Yeah, it's another dangerous distraction. And the way, again, going back to my context, if you look at it from the perspective of narrative, don't get obsessed with engineering of it too much. It's exactly the same narrative as in the 2000s with the advanced CANDU reactor. This will solve X, 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 and X, and we have overcome all of our past problems. It's the same talk they're giving. Now they just swapped out a different design, but look how the advanced CANDU reactor, ended. They didn't sell any. The federal government spent over $500 million on a design that will never be built.
Okay.
And now we're doing it all over again.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
I don't know if you watched them or you were out of the country at the time, but there was the Chalk River hearings a few weeks ago. I don't think he was an expert on, advising a panel on how to carry forward with the nuclear, but he spoke for his age group and for the area he lived in, and he did it in a simple way, and it was moving, and it encapsulated people of his generation's view on it. And in the end, they're either about to start paying for it or they're already paying for this in their taxes. And why wouldn't they get up and say what's on their mind? But some of these presentations, sometimes the simpler they are, the more moving they are. Indigenous presentations are always excellent. And hearing from young people who are new to the issue is very moving.
Well, and the non-usual suspects, like I'm a usual suspect, right? And I have something to contribute, but I think it's, I've found that when I do an intervention, it's always, you raise all boats when more people are speaking out. And those personal stories that you mentioned, like I remember in 2012, the Darlington hearings, there was this young woman, she was in high school, Sandra, and her family was Ukrainian and had been impacted by Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. And she was just a little kid. She got permission from her principal to present. Mm-hmm. And she's suddenly in front of this big federal panel. And again, her point was like, Fukushima happened last year. My family was affected by this. How can it be that you've just ignored and never thought about emergency planning? Simple point. And you could also see that she had moved the commission in some ways, just with this common sense. Like it had an impact. I don't know how to quantify it, but she really moved them that way. And a similar one, a woman named Michelle, who had lived in Florida during hurricanes. And she just tore apart the claims they were making on emergency management, having been through evacuations. And her point was like, I live in Pickering now, and don't tell me that you're going to actually pull this off in like a densely populated area like this. Also, without any technical expertise, made an amazing point. And these were all, just newbie activists. They hadn't spoke to hearings before. And we all need to help each other, I think, have the courage to speak out, because it is us joining our voices together, but speaking out on these things that needs to happen to drive debate.
You talked about the structure of how the CNSC hearings are set up. Was there a different structure in place for the joint review panel? Like, it seemed to me that if you were part of the group of people who had already presented, you were able to ask supplementary questions to presentations given by people after your presentation.
Yes, they had changed the rules of procedure slightly so that I think I stood up and asked a question of Emergency Management Ontario. That after they presented, as you said, which you can't do right now at CNSC hearings. But it was just like a slight revision, and they extended, I think you had 20 minutes to make a presentation if you made a certain type.
But it seemed to me that at the end of the process of the question being asked and answered, once answered by the panel or their representatives, the protagonist, OPG or whomever, it seemed that the people who had already presented were on a list and could ask. They seemed to still be involved, the people who were part of the registered presenters.
Yeah, it was a panel process, and they also allowed us to put in final submissions. So we, at the very end, were able to respond to any outstanding issues or state my issues were not responded to. Or my concerns, and that doesn't happen typically in a CNSC process. It was a little bit better, that process, but then it went all the way.
I think it was a lot better.
Yeah.
If the goal is to hear from the public and make them feel like what they say counts. One of my previous guests actually translated a play in France, and the subject of the play was about nuclear hearings in France, and depicted it as a theater, a way to manufacture consent by saying you'd done all the consulting, you'd involved the public. How much of all of this is just theater?
That's a very good question. I think it changes with time. And I think we also need to be aware of being used. If we participate in the process, we have to be wary of not being co-opted by the process. And I think that's a difficult line to walk. And because, everything you just said, the CNSC will say at the end, they'll aggregate the number and say this many people participated to shore up their decision. And yet there's all these no-brain things like the ability to ask questions and cross-examine and have full access to information that we don't have. So when we go into the process, again, it's knowing your audience. Are you presenting to the commission that you want to be very strategic about, or are you also playing to a broader debate that you want to inform? If you're playing to the commission, you need to be very clear on not getting co-opted and how maybe you use their rules against them. The Pickering hearings in 2013, we were very good at using their rules of procedure to force them to respond to certain issues. We did these requests for ruling, and that's because in the past we would do these, we would raise issues and then they just would not respond to them or not even mention them in their rulings. So we found a line in their rules of procedure that said, if you invoke section X, they have to do X. So we started doing that, and it changed. We got a temporary license in that hearing and conditions on the license for, I think, the first time and I can remember. But it took a bunch of thinking and strategizing. It's not a neutral process. So, you need to go into it with your eyes wide open.
And you will correct me on this, is it in all of the hearings, or was it just the joint review panel where if they didn't have the answer to a question, they would file a paper containing that answer in the days after the hearing?
That was in the joint review process. That was a good. It was called an undertaking.
Yeah.
And then it was on paper that you could cite in the future, as opposed to a statement made by staff. On an interesting aside, something that I've learned is before staff go into these hearings, we make submissions, and they're usually done 60 days before the hearing or 30 days. And after that, what happens is staff spend their time writing talking points on how they'll respond to everything in our submissions that are approved by management. And they even practice it. They'll have like a hearing before we have the public hearing. And I've started to FOI these. You can actually see how they go through everyone's submission and line out their statements. And what's unfortunate about that is they have all this time to prep to how do we diffuse what they're saying, but we're not given the time to actually cross-examine them on their statements, to actually dig in. Like, they'll have their response, but we can't respond to them.
I've got a workaround for that.
Oh, yeah?
Have your oral presentation not reflect all the talking points you bring up in your written.
That's an option.
I've done that. So if I get up and I make a presentation, I'm lucky if I'm not kicked out before the end of my presentation, but they'll move to the next guest. Whereas when you give a presentation, the rest of the afternoon might be devoted to 3 hours of responding to your presentation. So there's something unique about your presentations that get them to stay engaged with you. I think that's the goal we're all working towards. I can't do it. But
it may not be your goal. Again, this going back to remember what your audience is.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to push the commission on certain things. And I put a bunch of thinking into where are they obviously saying things that have no support or evidence-based. Like, I call it the unassailable problem. Like where they haven't, checked all the boxes on how to respond. Finding those in their licensing documents, I put a bunch of time into this. Sometimes I'm better at it than others. But that forces them to respond. Like the obvious one was, you have never looked, we've mentioned before, you've never looked at the impacts of a major accident. That's an unassailable comment. Common sense. And the commission has spent like 5 years trying to respond to that. Even the emergency planning review that just happened, what came out of it was a recommendation that they commission a study looking at the impacts of an accident 7 years after Fukushima.
Okay.
But to your point, though, I think for someone perhaps with you being clear on, if you're going in there, you may not be there to convince the commission. You may be there to show people how stupid the process is. That's fair.
It brings me back to an obvious question. You almost just answered it. What have they done? What are the lessons learned for Canadian nuclear after Fukushima?
Well, they didn't learn the main lessons. Like after when Fukushima happened, I mentioned the NGO community asked them to delay hearings on new build until we learn lessons. They didn't do that. They rammed it through. And then the CNSC president founded like a review within a month of Fukushima. And what's notable is they scoped out what the causes of Fukushima were, probably because they didn't know them yet. And we've learned since then that Fukushima was caused by regulatory capture, human causes, institutions ignoring risk. And the CNSC review was all about technicalities and engineering. Will a tsunami hit this plant? Yes or no? If it did, what would we have to do? Totally misses the point of, they should have been like looking in the mirrors, like, is our regulatory system and oversight able to, deal with the tensions of industry influence? No, it's not. The Harper government fired the former president. So we didn't learn that main lesson. They've gone back and retrofitted some fine safety updates to some of the reactors. And then the other piece that I think is still outstanding is that the interveners and the environmental community has been raising is they never looked at the off-site impacts. They kept it all behind the line. And so this is the debate on emergency management that Ontario just updated their plan like 6 years later. But that's been a fight that's been run through the CNSC hearings. And that I think they are still very weak on in terms of addressing. And it goes right to the siting documents that you had mentioned. After Fukushima, they were supposed to update all their major regulatory documents to learn lessons from Fukushima. They said they finished all that like 3 years ago, but it's just now that they've updated their siting guide. And what was the major piece of contention in their siting guide? Well, there's no requirements in the siting guide to restrict population growth. It's the most obvious example. And I suspect that was taken over all by politics. They've just tried to delay it. And it has to do with Pickering is in the middle. If they published a siting guide that was at all credible, it would make the operation of Pickering look pretty undesirable.
And real estate agents might not like that as well.
Yeah. And so that's an example where we haven't won or learned our lessons.
So just a few thoughts. So people kept blaming the regulatory structure in Fukushima, and they use terms like man-made disaster. And as you point out, blame is often attributed to unique earthquakes and tsunamis, whereas the other way to look at it is station blackout, that almost no design of a reactor can survive between 7 and 21 hours without electricity, and that any number of different events could prevent a site from having electricity. So you shut the reactor down because there's, let's say, a fuel problem. But all it has to happen is for a power line to go down that feeds the plant, because batteries not included with nuclear power plants. And that kind of situation could happen anywhere at any time, regardless of whether it's a tsunami area or not. So I thought the real problem with Fukushima was a fundamental set of design flaws. And calling it man-made is to take the focus off the fundamental danger of nuclear and put it on just a management system.
I don't think it's just a management. Like, these are human-made devices. And, we have to stop deifying technology, that you can get a fail-safe technology that is able to control effectively a nuclear bomb from cascading out. Humans run reactors, and we have to admit that humans are fallible. And we did not do that in Canada with the CNSC review. This was just 4 years after Prime Minister Harper fired the head of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for imposing international standards on the Canadian industry. If you want to see an example of how a management system can be interfered with, it is right here, and we're still living with that. The Trudeau government hasn't replaced them. What you've noted around station blackout is true, and they've put in some replacement, some minor upgrades that are fine for that. But it's always, you need to be aware of we're always going to have blind spots in the regulatory system and in the design, because it's us that are making the design and the regulatory framework. So I don't think it's quite one or the other. I worry a lot about blind spots. And it's not a tsunami here. It could be a tornado or just industry influence, but it exists here as well.
The U.S. answer to Fukushima, one of their proposals, one of their lessons learned from Fukushima, was to essentially vent the reactor in a fuel accident. So this brings us back to the promise of containment, which is what they used to convince us all this would be a great idea back in the 50s and 60s, is the promise of containment. So if in a fuel accident the answer is to vent the reactor, whatever became of containment?
Well, venting's been around, in theory for a long time. And after Fukushima, for some of the plants, they've backfitted what they call filtered vents at Darlington. So it's a way of letting some of the pressure off while retaining most of the radionuclides that they didn't have before. Notably, they haven't installed it at Pickering because they said we don't need to. The plant will only be operating a few more years. So again, these are these cost-benefit decisions. To your point on containment, yeah, one thing that's worried me is there's always been, it's almost dogma in the industry, especially around emergency planning, that containment would be able to, hold in radiation for 24 hours. That's kind of their the main talking point all the time. And when I've reviewed their risk assessments that have come out over the past 10 years, they all include something called containment bypass accidents, which just means a lot of these old plants, especially Pickering and Bruce A, have a lot of piping that goes outside of containment that they wouldn't be allowed to build in new reactors, because one of those pipes breaks, that's the way the radioactivity is going to get out. And these are all like large release scenarios, and have fairly, according to their standards, fairly high levels or high probabilities. Like they're fairly likely. And they've ignored all this evidence that their understanding of the reactor design shows that containment wouldn't be useful. And even the upgrades they've done for Fukushima, like how they would come and like plug in the water to maintain, would be after these bypass accidents.
How are they going to get in there to do that?
Yeah.
Multi-reactor sites. So they exist elsewhere, but it's my understanding each reactor is in its own building. It's unique to Canada to have multi-reactors all under the same roof.
Yeah, well, it's not only their own containment. We had 3 reactors melt down at Fukushima, and they lost the ability to cool, control, and contain radiation at all 3 of those. And theoretically, because there was separate containment on each of them, they had still an ability to contain some of it. In Ontario, as you said, we share containment between 4 reactors typically, and arguably at Pickering it's up to 6 right now, and or with shared safety systems, and they did this to save money, point blank.
The other ways that our reactors are connected to each other are that they share a refueling channel. So they're not only, even if you imagined they were separate from each other, they're connected by fundamental systems. The other thing is, and is this true, that for a group of reactors, let's say a Pickering A or B or Bruce A or B, Is it one vacuum building serves a bunch of reactors?
Yes. And I think Pickering had shared between the 6.
Who thought that was a good idea?
Well, and I frankly think the vacuum building is overdone. Usually the response from industry will be, well, and in the event we'll use the vacuum building to do X. The vacuum building was still designed only to deal with an accident at one reactor at a time. So it's not a fail-safe as well. Just overall, you wouldn't be allowed to build these reactors today because of the lax or feeble containment system.
Everybody in Canada thinks CANDU reactors are the world standard and the best reactor design. Between the making 100 times the tritium as a US PWR makes, aren't they the worst reactor design?
My feeling is, to be fair to I don't want to use superlatives in one direction or the other with any reactor design. They all have flaws. And I'm not going to let nationalism get in the way of saying the Canadians are the best or the worst. We're probably middle of the pack like everybody else, but they all have flaws and they all have humans operating them. And they're all aging. And we're making commitments in Ontario now to run these plants to 2050. And we're replacing some of the components. We're not replacing all of the components. So yeah, it's a bit overwrought. And I think what's telling in the long run is these are still basically designs that were made in the 1960s. These are Gen 2 reactors. Nothing innovative about them at all.
What countries have we tried to sell our reactors to?
We've managed to sell to Romania, Argentina, China, and South Korea. All of that happened in the 1970s, more or less, except for China, which was in the 1990s.
Where did Pakistan get its nuclear technology?
I would have to go back and look this up. We may have given Pakistan a small...
See, this is a talking point that I've been working on.
Yeah.
So we sold nuclear technology to India under the promise of it not being used for weapons. They explode a nuclear weapon in 1974. We go ahead with an embargo. And it's my understanding there's a couple CANDU technology reactors in Pakistan, but that's just a guess. Somebody's got to clear that up. If that's the case, and the sale of nuclear technology to India led to nuclear weapons, and now both Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons, has Canada not played a role in either starting or supporting an arms race between India and Pakistan? And isn't that something that Ontarians need to think about when they're judging the morality of nuclear industry in Canada?
Well, I think I actually worry a lot at the federal level that we don't pay attention to this anymore. We helped, getting into the details a bit, but under George Bush Jr., he opened up nuclear relations with India after they'd been shut down after they blew up the atomic bomb in 1974 because everyone wanted to sell reactors to India. It was seen as a market that they could sell to.
And one of the things Harper did before he left government was to remove our embargo against India.
Yep. So we've more or less undermined the non-proliferation treaty by saying, well, if you get nuclear technology, you do something with it, we won't talk to you for a while, but we'll eventually let you back in the club. So it takes some of the moral suasion out of it. And now we're left with a situation where, with CANDUs, what worries me, this gets into a bit of a different topic, but where we may sell reactors in the future, it's basically the Chinese are the vendor. The Chinese are going to Argentina and saying, we will build a new CANDU for you. We have basically the technology, they gave it to us, and we'll finance it. And part of that deal is, as long as you build one more CANDU, the next reactor will be a Chinese design. So end of the line for CANDU. But what worries me is, where is Canada in that relationship talking about proliferation and safeguards? I've gone to the archives of Canada, and you can get the minutes from the 1970s of the cabinet meetings. And after India blew up the bomb, nuclear sales and proliferation were on the agenda of the Trudeau cabinet all the time. And they had just signed a deal with Argentina to sell them Balse 1, so the reactor they have now. And it actually came up at cabinet, well, we should probably ask for more safeguards, given what India just did. And the response was, well, we could do that, but we'd probably lose the contract. So maybe the next reactor will ask for more safeguards.
How come Chinese are building or selling CANDUs? Did we sell them a license, or did they just copy our design once we sold them?
When we sold China in the 1990s, it was under the Chrétien government, we sold them 2 reactors, the Xinshan reactors, and it was accompanied with the largest loan in Canadian history to get them to buy it, so we gave them money to buy it. And there was also, along with that deal, a lot of technology transfer. So the Chinese said, yeah, we'll buy it. You need to give us money for the loan, but we also want rights to a lot of the technology. So they more or less have the technology. And now they're in a state where we've privatized AECL to SNC-Lavalin. And we don't give loans out anymore. There's changes in rules to export development agencies in the late 1990s. So most first world countries, using that phrase, won't give loans to sell reactors like we used to in the 60s, and like what we did with China. And so that sets up a barrier, because most countries that would buy a reactor want money to do it. And China has lots of money that they want to loan out, and they want to develop influence in other parts of the world. So they're like, we're happy to finance this for you. And we run these 2 Xinjiang reactors. We have lots of the technology. We'll sell it to you.
So that's an interesting spin on it. So, because I thought it was weird that the Chinese, the only way our new reactor was going to be built at Hinkley Point was if the Chinese got involved in funding it, because the UK wasn't going to fork over the money to build such a crazy plant. But if the Chinese lent the money. But what you've sort of pointed out is that's not a new trick. Canada actually, it didn't invent it, but it was doing it already, lending out.
That's what we did for all of them.
Yeah.
Like it was the Chinese were doing, and the South Koreans, exactly what Canada did in the 1960s. We were trying to develop influence by giving away, selling reactor technology. And now it's this other, the competition is now picking that up. And but we're not, even though it's Canadian technology, and SNC-Lavalin may want to come in and make some minor money on the side, I've seen no proof that the federal government's watching over what safeguards should be, which should be a concern for all Canadians, because came out of public money, the development of this technology.
So I think a talking point I heard was that, you could export these nuclear reactors to, let's say, former hotspots, but there's no guarantee they won't fall out of your sphere of influence. So that's a thing, because who knows? And then you've got a situation like in Ukraine and maybe South Korea, where essentially these nuclear reactors are, in terms of geopolitics, they're self-installed landmines that complicate a war theater. So in Ukraine, you've got nuclear reactors in a war theater. In South Korea, the threat might not be a nuclear weapon from North Korea. It could be a conventional weapon sent to a nuclear power plant in South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in your nation's interest to self-install landmines.
But those nations are also looking for the same prestige and, I would say, the implicit threat of when you have a reactor. Everyone knows, like within a year, if you really wanted to, you could develop the bomb. Like, you've got the materials. That's what's always unsaid in these debates. And it will take something blowing up, unfortunately, for that to enter the public debate again. But it worries me a lot watching what's going on at the international level, and just the lack of any visible oversight by the Canadian government on these deals that maybe they'll never happen, but they're being talked about a lot in Argentina.
Now, just coming back to the man-made problem of nuclear reactors, particularly in Japan, this is a simplistic way of looking at it, but the CNSC is housed in the Ministry of Natural Resources. and one of its functions is exporting minerals and uranium. It's an obvious conflict of interest. It's exactly the same kind of conflict that happened. Wasn't there a connection between the Ministry of Education in Japan and its housing of its nuclear regulator? So, I mean, cooked into the system is, there's no hope of having objective questions asked. These panels are manned by 100% pro-nuclear. There's never a couple anti-nuclear people on the panels. We're shielded from the other half of the decision-making process, as you pointed out earlier. Other than economics, what's going to stop it?
First of all, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I say that a lot. Don't expect to kill this off in a day. And when you do, it tends to follow on bad moments like Fukushima. We saw a huge amount of change worldwide in a shift away from nuclear and the nuclear renaissance because of Fukushima. We saw less so in Canada, but to start from the positive, we're shutting 9 of 22 reactors. That is something that 10 years ago people would tell you is impossible. So we're on the way. It's a start, and we still have a long road. The government's committed in Ontario to rebuild the 10 remaining reactors, and everything seems fine right now. Most of the opposition is on renewables for dumb governance reasons here in Ontario, where they've done some things pretty badly. But moving forward, we should expect the screw-ups that we've seen historically to repeat themselves. And that'll start changing the narrative again. If you go back to 2005, all the energy debate was around the cost overruns at Pickering that led to the closure of 2 of those reactors. That was only 13 years ago, but it's faded from memory. I anticipate we'll see a similar cycle. And then the next piece, I think, is, as we've talked about on the shows, we need people to be speaking out against this and finding creative ways of opposition, whether they're through CNSC hearings or going to their municipal councillor or finding ways to speak out and raise these issues with politicians. You need that. And then I think the other piece more and more will be on the renewable side, on how do we enable this new industry and these new collectives of people that are the solution to also not only grow but speak out against the nuclear lobby. They didn't exist 10 years ago in Ontario. You had a few people up in Bruce County that put solar panels on their barn because they were like back to the landers. But now you have these communities that are looking to go 100% renewables, and that is really, to me, is where the dynamic and the debate is going to change. So it's, in a way, it's like it's not your grandfather's anti-nuclear movement. And there's some good pieces about that. We still need to be exposing, the costs, and we still need to be, demanding like higher levels of safety, and there actually be public review of all these things and public education. But the other side is like the solutions are real and visible now, and not only do we want them to grow, that's a new organizing base to get the remaining plants in Ontario shut down.
There are hearings coming up in June. Is there another one in May?
There's the Bruce hearings in May.
And what are the Bruce hearings about in May?
That's an interesting one. They went through relicensing and got a 5-year license in 2015. But they didn't get permission to rebuild the remaining 6 reactors at Bruce.
Okay.
And we were raising it at the time, saying this is in the government's long-term energy plan. And at the time, they were supposed to start rebuilding one of the plants, I think, last year. And they didn't have the safety case or anything else. And since then, they've got a new energy plan has come out where the first Bruce rebuild will start in 2020, and they've signed a contract. So they're coming back to the CNSC for a 10-year license and asking for permission, I think, to rebuild at least 2 of them. So that's their ask. So even though they have a license to 2020, it's effectively a request around the life extension where they'll debate what's called the periodic safety review, of where they've compared the plant against quote-unquote modern standards. So that's the day 2 hearing is in May.
The hearings that are coming up in June, that's for Darlington.
In June, the CNSC will hold, I think, 3 days of hearings on OPG's request for a new license for the Pickering station. And why this is important is OPG will also be asking to run Pickering even longer beyond its design life till 2024. At the 2013 relicensing hearings, they had a really hard time. Lots of people spoke out, raised issues about emergency management, and they got conditions on their license. But they did get approval to run the plant to 2020. And because that's when they said at that time they were going to run it to. What's happened since then is they've come back and the government has said, if you can get approval to run the station until 2024, we'll allow you to do that if it's cost effective. So they're coming back yet again, asking for a 10-year license, and within that license to run for another 4 years, when the plant should have been shut down 2013-14 at the end of life.
And that's because the tubes have a given number of full-time work hours associated with their expected lifespan.
Yes. What's interesting with Pickering is because of high cost, they've decided against rebuilding it like Bruce and Darlington. They made that decision in 2010. And what's been happening since then is originally they believed, well, we need replacement reactors for this. It's funny how change happens and you don't even realize it. So their proposal was, we will run Pickering beyond its design life till 2020 because we believe then there'll be new reactors operating at Darlington to replace it. That was the original justification. What has happened since then, of course, is electricity demand has continued to decline, and the government even canceled new build, saying there was no electricity demand or need for it, but they've kept operating Pickering. And because they've continued operating Pickering, almost all of the power is being exported to Michigan at a loss. It's almost all surplus. They've at the Ontario Energy Board, they've made filings with the graphs, and it's last year in 2007 we exported I think 19 terawatts of electricity, and Pickering produced 19 terawatts of electricity. And that is frankly one of the main causes of our increases to our electricity costs, because we're buying it at like 8 cents. I don't know the exact number, but then selling it to Michigan at about 2 cents. That loss in between goes on what's called a global adjustment. But amazingly, that original justification has disappeared, and now they're saying, well, we want to run it for 4 more years because reactors will be under refurbishment and will need more reserve power. But even then, almost all of it is exported.
So without tipping your hand too much, what do you expect you'll be saying on behalf of Greenpeace at these hearings in June?
I think they shouldn't run it past 2020. We intervened in good faith in 2013 on they would be shutting this down. And now they're coming back in this patchy way, saying we want another 4 years, but we don't have to do these safety improvements that we should have done if it was running that long. So that would be one. 2, I think I'm going to talk about siting and emergency management. Like these 2 off-site issues continue to be a big, haven't been resolved since Fukushima. And this is the plant where we should be concerned. It's in Toronto. And yet the CNSC says, well, for siting restrictions, that's up to the province. The province says that's up to the CNSC. And for emergency management, it's the same thing. We still don't even have a study on the impacts of Fukushima on that. But overall, I think it's really, there's no justification for this plant moving forward. And we need people to speak out against it. It's after the election. And again, going back to, you can have 2 audiences at these hearings. After the CNSC makes a decision, it will still go back to provincial cabinet to make the final decision. So having people speak out at the hearings and also tell newly elected MPPs that they don't want this is really important in the next couple months.
These hearings are fascinating. I've learned some of the most incredible things I've learned about nuclear by watching these hearings. The most incredible moment was, I think it was at a Darlington hearing last year. The fire marshal commented on the plan to shelter in place. And I heard the most incredible thing I never thought I would hear such a thing. The fire marshal, of all people, was pointing out, you can't, in Canada, when it's negative 20 half the year, seal off your house with duct tape and shelter in place. Hot water tanks, furnaces, they require 2 3-inch diameter pipes from the outside to feed fresh air into your house as a requirement. Just to let the gases flow up the chimney, you need that. So we'd be dying of carbon monoxide in our sealed off, taped off houses. And then of course you were pointing out how people just looking at the evacuation in Florida could see that an evacuation plan was an impossible thing. They were having to force people to go back to the gas station just to man the pumps, and trucks opposing a flow of people out would have to be coming in to provide gasoline and pick people up. It's just check out rush hour on the 401 any given day of the week, and you can see that these plans don't make any sense, whether it's shelter in place or evacuate. I don't think it's hard to poke holes in their plans with such simple fundamental flaws. So these are things that anybody can talk about and ask about.
Especially on emergency management. Like, you don't have to get into the technicalities of how the plant happens. It's not if or how. It's like, what do you do when it happens? And this ends up how people organize themselves. You can go to your school and ask, what's the emergency plan if you're in Scarborough? And I know people, an activist up in Bruce did this. She went and asked the school where her daughter was, like, where's the emergency plan? You're supposed to have one. And they didn't have one. She raised that at the CNSC hearings. I'm sure that's true in a lot of other cases. There's a lot of, if you think about what would have to be done, especially in Eastern Toronto, and who should have these plans, that there's some interesting, easy research people could do and just where they live, that could be brought in front of the commission.
You mentioned you live, downtown, near Lambsdown. How can we have a pellet fabricating factory in the middle of Canada's largest city? How is that possible?
History, just like we have Pickering. If you think about it, Pickering it's the same thing. There's no siting standards, no requirements. And with the pellet factory, there was the rail lines. It's attracting attention now because it was a formerly working class neighborhood. It's becoming gentrified. New people are moving in and going, what's this?
It's feet away from Forest Hill, which I've always thought is hysterically funny.
You put lines on a map and people, people see them later, but it's the neighborhood's changing.
Okay.
And
furthermore, the Mississauga train derailment was an outrageous train accident. The CPR rail lines go right through, literally, this property. And so it was a GE Hitachi pellet fabrication plant, but it's now been bought by BWXT, which is Babcock and Wilcox, which is America's largest, it's their SNC-Lavalin / AECon, yeah? And so, that's an old, respectable company that seemed to have gotten itself involved in nuclear. So it's just weird. Why would GE Hitachi sell? Is that part of the economics of it all? There's Westinghouse's bankruptcy. There's, all the corporations in the West that deal with this stuff are bankrupting or getting bailed out left, right, and center. If these things are so great, how do you explain all that? And why would GE Hitachi want to sell?
Well, I forget the details, but I think GE Hitachi sold off a bunch of its nuclear assets. So we've seen a bunch of sell-offs since Fukushima. There tends to be these rounds of, it'll be called consolidation. But someone pointed out to me that if someone wanted to sell a reactor in the United States right now, there'd be no one there to sell it. Like, well, Westinghouse isn't selling, GE Hitachi isn't selling, Candu Energy isn't there. The only people selling reactors worldwide are the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Russians in active sales. The French are still, they're having all these problems with the EPR, but even Areva has had to be restructured. So some of these companies I think are getting out.
I thought that was foreshadowing. So Westinghouse's bankruptcy was so spectacular that it caused Toshiba to have to sell off some of its divisions. So I kept thinking, oh, well, is there a parallel there with GE Hitachi?
They just may have had more foresight on where they wanted to go as a company. I think GE is investing a lot more in renewables, if I remember.
Wow.
That's the division where, again, they're seeing what's being sold worldwide. We're an engineering company. We like to make things, and windmills are selling. So they've made a choice, which is probably a wise one.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that is just a cheap shot to say that the only countries that are selling nuclear reactors are totalitarian, non-democracy governments.
I don't think it's a cheap shot, but it is also telling that when we were selling reactors in the 70s, we also tended to sell them to dictatorships like Argentina, Romania, and China. Fair is fair.
This is a question I ask all these activists. Activism is this psychological swing from it's hopeless, you can't fight City Hall, to this sort of righteous indignation at the thought that everything on earth doesn't make sense. For a lot of people, that's a manic depressive swing. There's a price for that swing back and forth. Do you encounter that? Because maybe not you, but you in the world of activists.
I see it a lot actually in anti-nuke activists. Yeah.
Okay.
There tends to be there's some paralysis that goes on. Even like take the CNSC hearings for example. People get really caught up on like, oh, it's futile with the CNSC hearings. And what I always say back is like, look what everyone working and succeeding in fighting pipelines is doing. They've used the NEB to expose what a shitty system this is. It's not about convincing the NEB to do X. It's about using it as a platform to show what's wrong with the system. Not everyone agrees with you and knows how corrupt the system is. We need to expose that. But I think I've seen a lot of paralysis where people are like, oh, we've already done that. And I used the example before of, the things that do give me hope is when young activists have come to hearings, they come out of it with a lot of resolve. Like they've seen it and it's changed them, and they continue to be activists to this day. So that's how you build movements, right?
So the new builds that they were proposing at Darlington, this is just out of left field here, but they were proposing new reactors at Darlington, and so those proposals were AP1000s, and Westinghouse is now bankrupt. I just can't help but wonder what would happen had we signed those contracts with what we're seeing at Vogtle and VC Summer now discontinued, and the bankruptcy of Westinghouse.
Well, and what happened with New Build is a good example of how like a right to know or disclosure campaign may seem a little nerdy, but works. What went on there was basically we said to the government, there's been all these cost overruns. You need all-in cost. Like, look at let's not wait to 20 years. We want to know what the full cost will be. So when they did, and all the cost sharing, the risk has to be with the builder. They say they can do it on time and on budget. Let them work that into their cost estimates. And when they did, it was too expensive. That's what killed it. And that worked. That was a strategy that worked. We haven't won that on the refurbishments. they're using all these shell games to get around what the real cost is. There's no OEB vetting of it, but it worked on new build. So yeah, we run into paralysis, but we also need to reflect on like all the stuff that we've won.
Mm-hmm. If they went ahead and signed a contract to build 2 more reactors at Darlington, how personally would you take that?
Yeah, it's like the if Spider-Man met Superman kind of what if comic books, but I think it would have been pretty hard. And on reflection, I always use the phrase, you make your own luck. And if Fukushima hadn't happened, I don't really know what would have happened, given the way this province is. Like, it's so pro-nuke compared to worldwide. Fukushima happened and changed a lot.
So another thing that I'm kind of been curious about that's maybe positive is, even though in the media and amongst general public opinion, as uninformed as it may or may not be, they did go from a plan to build 1,000 reactors in the United States to this dying nuclear renaissance that we have now. And I've often wondered that even though it wasn't talked about in the media and is never talked about at the dinner table, this could be a fantasy of mine, but it seemed to me that after Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, the 2 of those incidents, that changed the policy decisions. Even though we weren't talking about it in the public and we weren't reading about it in the news, it did actually make a difference at the decision level. A profound difference to go from 1,000 reactors to just a couple of them being built. So that's kind of hopeful. Even if the public doesn't get it, it seems that some policymakers seem to have been getting it.
Well, yeah, if you graph when reactors went online, the peak was 1986 when Chernobyl happened. Then it all dropped off. And I think what Fukushima did in 2011 is the early 2000s, the industry tried to create a narrative of like, we've learned our lesson, we have new technology that will solve that problem, et cetera, et cetera. And then it slowly fell apart. There was the cost thing at Darlington, $26 billion all in. That wasn't quite on point or what they were predicting. And then with Fukushima, people just realized, and yeah, that happened again. And decisions changed for the better. There's some financial institutions, I think, called Fukushima an inflection point in global energy debates. We have seen a huge shift in investment towards renewables. Like, even Japan, we forget, had plans to build new reactors before Fukushima. Those plans are more or less off the table, but they're actually installing lots of renewables now. Not enough, but they're going that way. It changed the direction of a G7 country.
Just to be Debbie Downer here, where is the next nuclear reactor accident going to happen?
I would never make predictions like that. Again, humans cause them. Bad technology causes them. It will be a mix wherever we have a blind spot.
My guess is China, because I can imagine public hearings.
China, Russia, maybe the UK. They've been running their reactors past their design life as well. That's why they're accidents. You can't predict them.
That was Shawn-Patrick Stensil, a senior energy analyst with Greenpeace Canada. Shawn-Patrick also works as a radiation protection advisor for Greenpeace International and participated in radiation monitoring work at Chernobyl and Fukushima. Shawn-Patrick Stensil is also an energy and climate campaigner with Greenpeace Canada. His campaign work focuses on building a sustainable nuclear-free climate-friendly energy system in Ontario. He specializes in nuclear issues. You can sign up for the Greenpeace Toronto anti-nuclear group Don't Nuke TO. If you want to join the fight and close reactors in the GTA, please join. If you want to speak out against Pickering, sign up for that. See our podcast webpage for links to Don't Nuke TO and ways to get involved and speak out against Pickering. Shawn-Patrick Stensil spoke to us in our studio in Toronto.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher. Our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes. If you enjoyed the show, please rate us.
I'm Dave Archer.
And I'm Shawn-Patrick Stensil in downtown Toronto.